The statistical absurdity of racism. Imagine for a moment that every human being on Earth, from the Amazon rainforest to the streets of Tokyo, from the Arctic Circle to the plains of Africa, is a book. Billions of books bound in different covers, some worn, some new, some brightly colored, others faded. And now imagine opening those books and discovering that 99.9% of the pages are exactly the same. The same sentences, the same paragraphs, the same story. That is not a metaphor. That is biology. Modern genetics has revealed something extraordinary. No matter where we come from, no matter what we look like, we share 99.9% of our DNA. The tiny fraction that differs, just 0.1%, is what accounts for every bit of human diversity you can see and every bit you cannot. Skin tone, eye color, hair texture. Even those subtle differences in facial features that people have historically used to divide the world into so-called races, all of it is contained within that razor-thin margin of difference. And yet, that minuscule fraction has been weaponized for centuries. Wars have been fought over it. Civilizations have enslaved and exterminated entire populations because of it. Political systems have been built to privilege some and oppress others based on it. This is the greatest sleight of hand in human history, taking a biological near clone of yourself, pointing to a microscopic variation, and declaring, "You are not like me." But here's the thing. When we pull back the curtain, when we examine the numbers with clear eyes, racism collapses into a statistical absurdity. The science is unambiguous. The very idea of distinct biological races, separate branches of humanity, dissolves under the weight of the evidence. Most genetic variation is not between so-called races at all. It is within them. Two people from the same village can be more genetically different than two people from opposite sides of the planet. Over the next 30 minutes, we are going to dismantle the biological myths that have propped up racism for hundreds of years. We will trace the origins of this false idea from the slave ships of the 17th century to the laboratory benches of modern genetics. We will reveal why skin color is nothing more than a sun-driven adaptation, why the vast majority of human variation has nothing to do with what's visible to the naked eye, and why your personal ecosystem of microbes, the invisible passengers living inside you, is a far more unique biological fingerprint than the color of your skin. This is not a feel-good slogan. This is hard science, backed by decades of research from anthropology, evolutionary biology, and genomics. And once you understand the numbers, once you see the overwhelming unity of our species through the lens of data, you will realize how profoundly wrong racism is, not just morally, but mathematically. So let's begin at the only place we can, the bedrock statistic that should end the conversation before it starts. That all humans, no matter who they are or where they come from, are 99.9% the same. One species, one code. To understand why the statistic of 99.9% similarity between all humans is so powerful, we need to step inside the most complex library in the known universe, the human genome. Every single cell in your body, from the neurons firing in your brain to the skin cells you shed without thinking, carries the same instruction manual, about 3 billion letters of DNA. This code is written in a language of just 4 chemical letters, A, T, C, and G, and yet it builds everything you are. Now here's the staggering part. If you took any two people on Earth, no matter how different they look, and lined up their 3 billion DNA letters side by side, letter after letter, match after match, you'd find they are identical in 99.9% of those positions. That's not an average. That's not an estimate. That's the cold, hard readout from our genetic sequencing machines. In that small space is every visible difference between people. Your height, the curl of your hair, the shape of your nose, the tone of your skin, your predisposition to certain diseases, even the way you metabolize caffeine. all of it crammed into 1,000th of your genetic blueprint. It's not as though every individual is a radically different genetic snowflake in that remaining fraction. What's really happening is that human beings, as a species, are astonishingly genetically homogeneous. In fact, we have far less genetic diversity than many other species on this planet. Your pet dog, for example, is part of a species with vastly greater genetic variation than humans. Chimpanzees, our closest evolutionary relatives, show about 4 times more genetic diversity than we do. Why? Because anatomically modern humans are a very young species. We emerged in Africa perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, and every single person alive today descends from that same small ancestral population. We then spread across the planet in waves, never separating long enough or completely enough to form distinct subspecies. For hundreds of thousands of years, we've been swapping genes, sharing DNA across geographic and cultural boundaries. This relentless mixing is why no genetic wall exists between any 2 human groups. There is no genetic test in existence that can tell you someone's race in the way society defines it, because those categories don't exist in biology. At most, a DNA test can tell you where some of your ancestors likely lived, but even that is painted in gradients, not solid blocks. It's like looking at a watercolor map with colors that blend into one another, not the crisp lines on a political globe. And this is where the absurdity of racism begins to take shape. But there's an even deeper twist to this story. Not only are we almost entirely alike, but most of the genetic variation we do have isn't between so-called races at all. It's between individuals within the same group. Which means the person you pass in your own neighborhood could be more genetically different from you than someone living thousands of miles away. The 90-10 rule, why your neighbor is your statistical cousin. Here's where the numbers get downright explosive. Once scientists had the ability to read the human genome, they didn't just compare one person to another. They looked across hundreds, then thousands of genomes from all over the planet. What they found should have erased the idea of biological race forever. It turns out that about 85 to 90% of all human genetic variation is found within any single population. Let that sink in. Take a group of people from one city, one village, even one small island, and you will find almost the entire genetic diversity of our species right there in that one place. The differences between you and your next-door neighbor, even if you look alike, represent the vast majority of the variation humans are capable of. Now, what about the differences between populations? Say, between someone in Ghana and someone in Norway. That accounts for the remaining 10 to 15% of genetic variation. That's it. And that small fraction doesn't divide neatly into races either. It fades and blends across geographic space, like colors merging in a sunset. The human gene pool isn't made up of separate buckets called black, white, Asian, or indigenous. It's one enormous swirling ocean, and most of the waves happen right where you stand. This reality explodes the foundation of racial thinking. Racism depends on the belief that humanity is divided into deep, fundamental categories, that there's some kind of unbridgeable genetic canyon between us and them. But the truth is the opposite. The biggest differences are not between the categories we've invented. They're between individuals, period. Some people hear this and immediately ask, then how can scientists tell where someone's ancestors came from with a DNA test? And the answer is subtle. Researchers can sometimes identify small patterns in DNA, tiny differences in the frequencies of certain genetic markers, that hint at where your recent ancestors might have lived. These are called ancestry informative markers, and they work like historical footprints, tracing human migration over time. But here's the catch. These markers don't define biological races. They are statistical clues, not hard boundaries. They show that human variation is colonial, meaning it changes gradually across geography, with no sharp dividing lines. Imagine walking from West Africa to Northern Europe over many generations. As you move, the genetic frequencies shift bit by bit, like a slow fade between two colors. At no point do you step across an invisible line where one race ends and another begins. What this means is that the categories we call races are human inventions, not biological discoveries. They are mental shortcuts, and poor ones at that, because they ignore the vast overlap between populations. And yet, for centuries, people have taken the most visible, superficial differences, the ones that barely register in our total genetic makeup, and turned them into symbols of division and hierarchy. Which brings us to perhaps the most misleading of them all, skin color. The superficiality of phenotype, why skin color lies to us. From the time we are children, our eyes are trained to notice differences. We see light skin and dark skin, straight hair and curly hair, blue eyes and brown eyes. Our brains, built to recognize patterns, turn these visible traits into instant categories. And for centuries, societies have taken those surface impressions and inflated them into something they are not, proof of deeper biological divisions between people. But the truth is this: skin color, hair texture, and facial features are some of the most misleading clues you could ever use to judge genetic difference. These traits, collectively called phenotypes, are influenced by only a tiny portion of our genome. The genes involved in determining skin color, for instance, make up less than a fraction of 1% of our total DNA. Out of roughly 20,000 human genes, just a handful affect the amount and type of pigment your skin produces. This pigment, called melanin, is manufactured by specialized cells in your skin known as melanocytes. The more melanin you produce, the darker your skin appears. The less you produce, the lighter your skin. But here's the catch. The instructions for how much melanin your cells make are spread across multiple genes, each making a small contribution. This is what scientists call a polygenic trait. In fact, if you lined up every human being on Earth from the darkest to the lightest skin tone, you would see a gradual, unbroken gradient. No sharp borders, no natural cutoff points where one race ends and another begins. And here's something even more surprising. The genes for skin color don't come bundled with the genes for other traits. Just because two people have similar skin tones doesn't mean they are more closely related genetically. The visual similarities are just that, visual. They do not map neatly onto the deeper genetic reality. The tragedy is that humans have latched onto these trivial, visible differences and used them as markers for inclusion or exclusion, superiority or inferiority. Skin color has been treated as a badge of identity, a justification for slavery, a tool for segregation, and a weapon for discrimination. And yet, biologically, it's one of the least significant traits we possess. The real story behind skin color is far more fascinating than its genetic footprint, and it reveals just how hollow the concept of race truly is. Because skin color isn't about race. It's about adaptation, a living record of how our ancestors' bodies responded to the sun. The science of skin and adaptation, not a boundary. To understand why human skin comes in so many shades, we have to step back in time, far back, to the dawn of our species in Africa. Picture our ancestors living under the relentless tropical sun. The ultraviolet rays were intense, pounding down day after day. Under these conditions, dark skin wasn't just common, it was essential for survival. The hero of this story is melanin, the pigment that gives color to our skin, hair, and eyes. Specifically, a form called eumelanin, which is a natural sunscreen built right into our bodies. It absorbs harmful ultraviolet radiation before it can damage DNA or strip away something crucial from our blood: folate. Folate, a B vitamin, is vital for reproduction. It helps form healthy sperm and is critical during pregnancy to prevent birth defects. Too much UV light can destroy folate in the blood, and in the intense sunlight of equatorial Africa, that's a real threat. The people whose skin cells produced higher levels of melanin were better protected, healthier, and more likely to pass their genes on. Over countless generations, this pressure shaped the ancestral human population into one with rich, dark skin tones. but humans are wanderers. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, small groups began leaving Africa, moving into the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and eventually the far corners of the globe. And with these migrations came new environments, many with far weaker sunlight, especially in higher latitudes. Why scarce? Because our bodies also need sunlight to make vitamin D. This vitamin is crucial for absorbing calcium and building strong bones. Without enough UV exposure, vitamin D levels plummet, leading to brittle bones, rickets, and serious health problems. Here, dark skin, which was perfect for blocking UV in the tropics, became a disadvantage. It blocked too much light. Individuals with lighter skin, who could absorb UV more efficiently, were better able to make enough vitamin D in these dimmer environments. Over generations, natural selection favored lighter skin in these populations. And here's where the science deals a final blow to the idea of race. This lightening of skin happened independently in different parts of the world. Europeans and East Asians, for example, both evolved lighter skin, but through different genetic changes. The specific gene variants that lighten skin in Europeans are not the same ones that lighten skin in East Asians. This is called convergent evolution, nature finding separate solutions to the same problem. The result is a global spectrum of skin colors that reflect one thing above all else: the balance between protecting folate in high UV regions and producing vitamin D in low UV regions. As you travel the world, skin tones shift gradually with latitude and sunlight levels. No borders, no abrupt jumps. Just a smooth, continuous gradient, what scientists call colonial variation. It shows that all humans are highly adaptable members of one species, capable of adjusting to almost any environment on Earth. Skin color isn't a boundary between peoples. It's a record of our shared journey, painted on the canvas of our bodies by the sun. Yet despite the simplicity of this truth, skin color has been twisted into one of the most enduring myths of difference. And the irony is that, in the grand scheme of our genome, skin pigmentation is almost laughably insignificant. The statistical insignificance of pigment. For all the power it has been given in human history, skin color is, in genetic terms, almost nothing at all. Out of the roughly 3 billion base pairs in the human genome, the handful of genes that influence pigmentation make up less than a fraction of 1%. Earlier, we established that humans differ from one another in about 0.1% of their DNA, roughly 3 million base pairs. The genetic instructions for skin color account for only a sliver of that difference. And yet, this microscopic fraction of our biology has been inflated into one of the most divisive social markers in history. Entire empires have risen and fallen. Laws have been written, wars have been fought, and lives have been destroyed, all based on this infinitesimal set of genes. The absurdity doesn't stop there. Skin color tells you next to nothing about who someone's ancestors were, and even less about their abilities, character, or worth. If the science were our guide, we would have discarded skin color as a marker of human difference centuries ago. But history didn't follow science, it followed power. The social construct of race, a tool, not a discovery. If biology doesn't divide us into races, then why has the idea been so persistent? Why does it still shape the way people see themselves and each other? The answer isn't found in genetics or evolution, it's found in history. Race, as we know it today, is not a scientific discovery. It is a human invention, crafted in very specific moments to serve very specific purposes. For most of human history, people did not think of themselves in racial terms. They identified by family, by tribe, by language, by religion, or by the land they lived on. Medieval Europeans spoke of the Irish race or the English race in ways that meant little more than nationality or shared ancestry. The rigid, color-coded categories we recognize now, black, white, Asian, simply didn't exist in the same way. The modern concept of race began to take shape during the 17th and 18th centuries, right alongside two powerful historical forces: European colonial expansion, and the transatlantic slave trade. As European powers spread across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they encountered vast populations of people who looked different, spoke unfamiliar languages, and lived by different customs. And they had a problem, a moral one. How could they justify conquering, enslaving, and exploiting other human beings, many of whom were already part of advanced civilizations? The solution was as cynical as it was effective. Redefine those people as fundamentally, biologically different and inferior. Early naturalists and philosophers like Carl Linnaeus and Johann Blumenbach began classifying humanity into groups based on physical features like skin color, skull shape, and hair type. At first, these classifications were presented as varieties of a single species. But as colonialism and slavery deepened, those classifications hardened into a hierarchy, with Europeans conveniently placed at the top. By labeling certain groups as less evolved or naturally suited for labor, colonizers could claim that conquest and enslavement were not only justified but beneficial, a civilizing mission. This pseudoscience, often called scientific racism, became the intellectual armor for systems of oppression. It turned prejudice into something that could be dressed up in charts, measurements, and Latin names. It's crucial to understand that this was never neutral or objective work. The so-called science of race was built backwards. The desire to dominate came first, and the justification followed. As legal scholar Dorothy Roberts has pointed out, the concept of biological race was developed to rationalize slavery, not the other way around. Once in place, this system of classification proved incredibly durable. It seeped into laws, religious teachings, education, and medicine. Generations grew up being told that racial categories were as real and natural as the categories of animals and plants. And because those categories were enforced by social, political, and economic power, they shaped reality itself. This is what makes race so dangerous. It is a fiction that became fact in its consequences. It organizes access to wealth, safety, and opportunity. It dictates who gets the benefit of the doubt and who is seen as a threat. And because it masquerades as biology, it has fooled even scientists into looking for differences that aren't there. The ecotype argument and its limitations. When faced with the overwhelming evidence that race is not a biological reality, some people try to salvage the idea by reframing it. They concede that the broad racial categories we use in everyday life, black, white, Asian, and so on, are imprecise and socially constructed. But then they suggest that maybe there's a more scientific version of race hiding in the concept of ecotypes. They don't come bundled together in coherent packages that match our racial categories. High-altitude adaptations are found in Tibetans, some Andeans, and certain East African populations, groups that, by folk racial standards, are considered entirely different races. The genes for lactose tolerance are common in Northern Europeans, certain Middle Eastern groups, and some African pastoralist communities, again cutting across racial lines. Even more importantly, these adaptations make up a vanishingly small part of the human genome. The vast majority of our DNA is unaffected by them, and nothing about these local traits changes the fact that humans are overwhelmingly genetically similar. And thanks to human migration and intermarriage, even these localized traits don't stay confined for long. Genes move. People mix, boundaries blur. Over the span of thousands of years, a blink in evolutionary terms, adaptations that once belonged to a single population can spread to others. The human story has never been one of isolation. It has always been one of connection. So while the ecotype idea is scientifically valid in the sense that local adaptations exist, it is useless as a justification for race. Ecotypes don't map onto the racial divisions our societies created. They don't tell us anything about worth, intelligence, morality, or any of the other qualities racism pretends are biologically predetermined. And if you still need proof of just how flimsy race is as a biological category, it's time to look beyond the human genome entirely. and see that the greatest biological differences between us aren't in our own DNA at all. They're in the vast, invisible world of organisms that live on and inside us. The microbiome twist, the biggest differences you can't see. If you really want to talk about biological individuality, if you truly want to measure the biggest genetic differences between people, you have to look beyond our human DNA. Because the most staggering diversity of all isn't in the 0.1% that makes each human unique. It's in the teeming, invisible ecosystem that lives on and inside us, the human microbiome. Every person is home to trillions of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, archaea, and viruses that live on your skin, in your mouth, and most of all, in your gut. By sheer number of cells, you are more microbe than human. These tiny passengers aren't just freeloaders. They are essential to your survival. They help digest your food, produce certain vitamins, train your immune system, protect you from harmful microbes, and may even influence your mood and behavior. Now here's where it gets truly mind-bending. While our human genomes are about 99.9% identical, our microbiomes are wildly different. Your personal mix of microbial species, and even the strains within those species, is unique to you. Two people may share a vast majority of their human DNA, but have entirely different microbial communities. And the genetic scale of this difference is almost impossible to comprehend. The human genome has about 20,000 genes. Your gut microbiome alone carries an estimated 3.3 million unique genes, roughly 150 times more than the human genome. From a genetic standpoint, your microbiome makes you far more unique than your human DNA ever could. This is the ultimate irony for the racist worldview. If someone were truly obsessed with finding deep biological divisions between people, they'd have to forget skin color entirely and start comparing gut bacteria. But of course, no one does that. Partly because it would be absurd and partly because you can't see a microbiome. And that's the point. Racism is built on visible differences, no matter how biologically meaningless they are, while ignoring the vast, invisible differences that actually exist. If the world decided tomorrow to divide people by microbiome type, it would be just as arbitrary and just as unscientific as dividing them by the color of their skin. So when we step back and look at the big picture, the absurdity is clear. Humans obsess over the wrong differences. The fixation on melanin, on facial features, on the smallest scraps of variation in our genome is a distraction from the overwhelming truth. Biologically, we are one family. The lines we've drawn are cultural lines, not biological ones. Racism as a statistical and scientific absurdity. We began this journey with one statistic, that all humans share 99.9% of their DNA. That fact alone should end the debate. Racism rests on a sliver of genetic difference, so small it barely registers in our shared humanity. Most variation is between individuals within the same group, not between so-called races. Skin color, the most abused marker of difference, is simply an adaptation to sunlight, encoded in a handful of genes, spread across the globe in a smooth gradient. Race was not discovered. It was invented, a political tool to justify slavery, colonialism, and exploitation. It masqueraded as science to make injustice look natural, embedding itself into law, medicine, and culture. Even now, echoes of that false biology distort research and shape medical decisions. The science is clear. Humanity is one species, one extended family. Our differences are real and beautiful, but they are surface ripples on a deep ocean of similarity. The categories of race exist only in our minds and in the systems we've built, not in our DNA. And that truth, simple, powerful, undeniable, is the beginning of a world where dividing people by race is not just wrong, but laughably unscientific. The day we understand that is the day racism loses its last shred of credibility.